Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the next webinar at presented by Grantham University's Math Center for the BA215 Statistics class. Today we're going to talk about how to work through the assignment for week 1, the second part of it, and in particular we're going to talk about how to use the mean, the range, and the variance to compare data sets. Now, initially, let's start with explaining what the mean and the range and variance are. The mean falls under central tendency, a measure of central tendency. This means that if you have a bunch of data, a bunch of numbers, it's the number that's right in the middle, or it tells us where the data would, what the middle of the data would be, where it would be. The measures of dispersion are measured by the range, are given by the range, the variance, and the standard deviation, and these talk about how spread out the data is. Today we're going to only focus on the mean, the range, the variance, and standard deviation. Again, the mean of a variable is computed by determining the sum of all the values in the variable in the data set, and then dividing by the number of the observations. If you want to know how to calculate this using Microsoft Excel, please see the webinar, the video about this recording, about this topic. Here, though, is an example of some data. We're just going to talk about how to interpret the data today. So we have some data about ATM fees in Los Angeles and New York City, comparing the two cities. And the question asks us to compare the means for the two cities' ATM fees, and then determine if there's a difference between LA and New York. Now, after having the data listed here in the put it into Excel running the data analysis toolpack and coming up with the mean for the numbers, I come up with this as an average for LA, and this is an average for New York. Now, the LA average is higher than the New York City average, and so for that reason, it would appear that the fees in LA are higher than in New York, just looking at averages. This is pretty straightforward. Again, if you don't know how to come up with this number in Microsoft Excel, please go to the earlier recordings in week 1 folder about calculating the mean and other descriptive statistics using Excel's data analysis toolpack. Okay, now once we've used averages to compare the two data sets, there's another way that we can compare them, and this is by using something called dispersion, the measures of dispersion. Now, the measures of dispersion, there are 3 types. The first one is called the range, and that is just the difference between the largest data value and the smallest data value. The range is just one number, not 5 to 10, not 6 to 12. It's just one single number. The variance is the deviation about the mean, and then the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. Now, when it comes to interpretation, the variance is difficult to interpret. We don't really use it to interpret numbers. We use it to interpret data. We use it to perform further calculations on the data set. What we use to interpret are the standard deviation and the range. They're both measures of spread or dispersion of the data, how spread out the data is, and it talks about how variable the data set is, or how much variation there is among the data. Now let's look at the example again. So we have the ATM fees for Los Angeles and the ATM fees for New York City. And the question has changed a little bit. Instead of asking about averages or asking about which one is higher, we want to know which one has more variation. That means more change from one value to the next, how much spread there is between the values. Now, if we go to Microsoft Excel and run the data analysis toolpack, we'll come up with LA having a range of 2 and a variance of 0.4598 and a standard deviation of the square root of the variance. We run the same analysis for New York, and we come up with a range of 1.5, variance of 0.2277, and a standard deviation of 0.477. Now, this information, again, you come up with using the Microsoft Excel tool pack, or you can do it by hand. I recommend you use the tool pack. But now, again, let's focus on how these two compare to each other. Now, you look at the ranges, and you'll see that LA's range is higher than New York's range. You'll look at the variance. You can compare them, but we're not going to. We're going to focus on the standard deviation here. It's easier to compare. The standard deviation for LA is also higher than the standard deviation of New York City. Now, what does this mean? The interpretation is that LA has a larger range, a larger standard deviation, and a larger variance in New York City. And so that means that the variation, that means one ATM might charge 50 cents. The next ATM might charge $3. The next ATM might charge 25 cents. The next one might go really high to $3.50 or something. So that means that the variation in LA is pretty high. It keeps on jumping. It goes from one small value to a high value to a small value to a high value. This is what variation means. Whereas in New York City, it's more stable. The cost for the ATM fees are more stable. There's not as much spread. Okay, so again, when we are comparing data sets using the means, it's pretty straightforward. We just talk about which one is higher, average. But when you're comparing using dispersion, using measures of dispersion, the range or the variance or the standard deviation, here you're talking about variation in the data set. And it's also pretty easy to explain. It just takes some practice. If you have any questions, please come to us at the Math Center. We are ready and willing and able to help you with any of your math questions, especially your BA215 questions. Thank you. Have a nice day.